Morning. Those of you who don't know who I am, I'm Lieutenant Collier, okay? Training officer. I'm gonna give a little bit of background. There's a relevance to this. My initial background, I started in the F-14 Tomcat, okay, which is was the Navy's greatest aircraft in the 1970s. It had seen its life for over 30 years of service. And we transitioned in the middle of my tour to the Super Hornet, the F-18 Echo and Fox. We got these off of the line from St. Louis with an hour of flight, 2 hours for flight time by the time they made it to the East Coast. There is such a thing as a new jet smell, okay? And that's what they were. And so we are flying the Navy's newest, state-of-the-art aircraft. Let me tell you, every time that we would go, of course, the operations we do in Iraq, Afghanistan, right? We're doing close air support. We're dropping our smart weapons. But is there much of a threat, air to air, or air from the ground to the air in Iraq or in Iraq, Afghanistan? No, it's not. Not unless you're down really low, really slow. There's not much of a threat. There's certainly no air-to-air threat. But, so who do we worry about in all our training? What do we worry about out in Fallon, Nevada? What's in Fallon? Anybody know?
Top Gun.
Top Gun. That's right. Top Gun is out in Fallon, Nevada. Okay? It's not Miramar, just on like the movie. When we go into Top Gun, who do you think we trained against? All right. Chinese. Okay? China, North Korea, we're more concerned about what threat they possess. Now somebody said Soviets. Okay, where do they get the aircraft? Well, former Soviet Union, right? We call that former Soviet Union aircraft, FSU. Right, so all our concern is what the threat is out there. Let me tell you, there's a big difference in a country who can pour all their industrial military might, at the direction of a regime, as opposed to something like the United States, a free market society, the democratic society, right? We have different contractors that we bid out. And unfortunately what happens when we do that, and although we love the free market, we also sometimes go to the lowest bidder. And maybe we don't get exactly what we need. And there comes a problem. So as I sit out there in Top Gun and I listen to all the top secret SCI briefs, there's the hairs on my neck are standing up. The major concern out there is what the real threat is. Because as we look at the former Soviet Union capabilities, okay, we look at what China and North Korea is developing, some of these other countries, it is scary. All right? It is very scary. And sometimes we walk away feeling a little bit defeated. Now, obviously, we train to those threats. We know the tactics. And I'm confident we can do a good job. But the point is that it's important that you know the threat that you are facing. All right? You have a great opportunity right here this morning to listen to the world that you're going to face. And how long are we going to be in the Middle East? Well, probably for a long time. But what happens is these other countries start developing. And you saw, if you watched them, obviously it was kind of big summer for you all, but the Olympics, what's happening over there? China just passed Germany, I think, with the GDP. Okay? They are growing. They are prospering. And the threat is real. All right? I'm going to turn it over right now to Professor Yu from the History Department. He's going to introduce our keynote speaker.
All right, thank you very much. Can you hear me? Yes? All right, I teach at the History Department. I run a program I like to call a dog and pony show called Asia Forum. We have almost weekly programs, and this is the first of the semester. And we're happy to be able to connect with Lieutenant Collier's program, Saturday morning training program on the issue vital to the present and future interest of our nation. Let me just introduce you to Mr. Richard Fisher. Mr. Fisher is a senior fellow with the International Assessment and Strategy Center. He has previously served as a senior fellow with the Center for Security Policy and editor of the Jamestown Foundation's China Brief, senior fellow with the House Republican Policy Committee, and the director of the Asian Studies Center of the Heritage Foundation in Washington, D.C. He's the author of China's Military Modernization, Building for Regional and Global Reach, which was published a few months ago by Prager, which is right here. It's available in Amazon. It's good, very good read. He also contributed to chapters on foreign influence in China's future submarine force, which is published by Naval War College 2 years ago. His articles have been published in the Jane's Intelligence Review, Jane's Defense Weekly, Far Eastern Economic Review, Asia Wall Street Journal, World Air Power Review, Air Forces Monthly, and Armed Forces Journal. And I have asked Mr. Fisher to talk about China's aircraft carrier program and its future power projection ambitions. However, when we talked after I make an announcement, he realized aircraft carrier definitely is a very important part of China's military modernization, but he also would like to expand that to a much larger picture, which I thought is a very, very good idea. So what he's going to do today is he's definitely going to talk about aircraft carrier program, but he's going to talk about much more. And I think if you have any particular interest in China's aircraft carrier project, and you can definitely discuss with him during the Q&A session. Without further ado, I give you Mr. Fisher.
Dr. Yu, Lieutenant Collier, thank you very much for this invitation and the privilege to speak and describe some very relevant information for a class that truly represents the best that our country has to offer. And from myself personally, as all I can speak for, I would like to offer my personal thanks to all of you who have chosen as your career to defend this country and ensure its survival. You will be making many sacrifices, as you are already, for all of us, so that at a minimum, the rest of us can sleep late on this very cold Saturday morning. But thank you very much. I've not had the privilege of serving in the American military, but I have had the honor of knowing many fine officers who have come from this academy. As far as personal background, I would say that my father served as a reservist in the Navy in the mid-1950s. And he was a radar operator on board a very small ship, a destroyer escort, the USS Haliger. And one of his favorite sea stories was one day when his ship was cruising in the Caribbean. He was at his station at the radar, and all of a sudden, a very large silver dollar-sized blip came across the screen. He didn't know what it was, so he quickly calls over the chief. The chief looks at it, says, "Fisher, it's broken. Turn it off." Well, within an hour, the whole crew of his ship were heaving their guts into the buckets. That big blip was a hurricane, and they were right in the middle of it. And his added detail of that day is that for lunch they had been served fried salami. Not a pretty picture. But I'd like to suggest to you that China is the big blip on the radar screens of your career. You certainly are the big blip on the radar screen of the People's Liberation Army, both collectively and personally, I guarantee you. Now, what I'd like to do this morning is give you an overview of a very narrow dimension of the challenge China poses, the military challenge. China challenges us on many other levels as well. Some of them not entirely negative, positive, economic. China is an economic competitor and will be ever more so. In a way that's good because it challenges us to be better ourselves economically. But China is also in the midst of a very fraught transition. It is led by a communist party, a revolutionary communist party in its early days that has settled into a status quo communist party which is trying to resolve the fundamental contradiction of remaining a dictatorship while encouraging an increasingly free economy. It won't work, but the leaders of the Communist Party of China are very resourceful. And a simple technology like, let's say, global positioning satellites, which has quickly become part of the soil of the larger electronic infrastructure of this country and increasingly the world, could extend the life of that Communist Party for a long time. So we don't know truly where China will be in a decade or in 3 or 4. The communist regime could collapse, and we have to be prepared for that. But in the meantime, China is building a military capability that is very worrisome, very troubling. China is the only country that is investing in the same range of capabilities and military technologies as is the United States. And guess what? Because they are so much larger than us, they can devote that many more people to this effort, and they will not only match our capabilities within the period of your career, they could exceed our capabilities. And that is what I want to try to impart today. So at a minimum, if you walk away from this hall this morning with one thought, it's this: do not fall asleep in Dr. Yu's class. He is truly an asset to this academy and to our country. He's a man who has truly made some amazing choices, and we are here to benefit from them as well as his perspective. Okay, so we begin. The key points that I deliver in this lecture are as follows. I don't need to read what you can see here, but this is the basic summation of what I will deliver in many, many parts over the next hour, if I can fit it all in. Okay. China today is led by a partnership, deep partnership that goes back to the revolutionary period when the Communist Party was just beginning its journey in the late 1920s, early 1930s. The Communist Party of China would not be in power were it for the People's Liberation Army. The People's Liberation Army would not have its power position in Chinese society were it not for the patronage of the Communist Party. The leadership of China and the leadership of the People's Liberation Army are united in the form of the Central Military Commission of the PLA. It is almost as if the President of the United States would chair the meetings of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. That doesn't exist here in our society because of our long-standing tradition of separation of powers and the very unique place in which and legal position of our military forces within our society. But in China, the military and the party at a certain point are basically one. And you would begin your career not only learning military skills, basic discipline, and then the technical skills needed for your specialty, but you would also be attending weekly, if not daily, indoctrination sessions. It's not just important for a Chinese plebe what you can do. It's probably more important to the Communist Party what you think. And believe me, you would be monitored very closely as to what you think. Very, very key to the Communist Party's claim of legitimacy is that they are the ones who are going to correct the historic wrongs given to China by outside powers. One of those wrongs was the division, separation of China's territory. And in particular, the most important part of that territory of China that was taken away, in their opinion, is Taiwan. Here we have some officers looking at a map of Taiwan. Unification with Taiwan is almost a religious objective for the Communist Party. And not just military personnel, but all Chinese citizens are taught from their earliest schooling experience is that the separation of Taiwan is a vast injustice committed to the people of China, and the unification of Taiwan with China is absolutely essential for China to truly progress and seek its destiny. Well, the objective facts are that Taiwan became separate as a consequence of the Communist Revolution. And for hundreds of years before the Communist Revolution, the governments in China only took a passing, if temporary, interest in what happened in Taiwan. It wasn't until Japan occupied Taiwan as a consequence of a Chinese-Japanese war at the end of the 1800s that governments in China became fixated on the future of Taiwan. And what has happened in Taiwan itself is also very fascinating and interesting. Taiwan was taken over and it became essentially a dictatorship until the late 1970s, early 1980s. Since that period, Taiwan has evolved to become the first example of a Chinese society that has evolved into a democracy. This is, for us and for this country, an amazing fact. If Taiwan can survive as a democracy, then it offers a hope that the remaining Greater China can learn from this example and hopefully follow that example. But if China is allowed to end Taiwan's democratic direction, that may allow China and its Communist Party to survive into the foreseeable future. It's the policy of the United States, as set forth in a 1998 law called the Taiwan Relations Act, to view threats to Taiwan as challenging the interests of the United States. I'm paraphrasing the language. This is a very important law. You should be familiar with it. It sets out what our relationship will be with the society on Taiwan without conveying full diplomatic recognition to the government there. We have a great interest, I would suggest to you, in Taiwan's survival. It may be the best way to avoid a century of conflict with a communist-led government in China that is unstable, that could opt to go to war or undertake small wars for political reasons, to bolster its power base domestically, and that if progressions remain as they are, will eventually become a global military power. Some of you might consider that seeking assignments in South America or perhaps our Africa Command might allow you to avoid the challenge of China. No. China is already a major economic factor in South America and Africa. it would be a principal concern for you. Here we have a not so recent graph from the annual Pentagon China military report that shows a progression for future Chinese military spending. We don't know exactly how much China spends on its military. They don't tell us. They don't tell their own people. Guessing that number is a great cottage industry in our intelligence community and elsewhere. China also has territorial ambitions, especially in East Asia, an area of operations that many of you may become very familiar with in the not-too-distant future. China and our ally Japan, which generously allows us to operate from bases on their territory, have sharp disputes over territory in the East China Sea, and there are regular naval clashes. We don't call them combatant clashes because they take place between Coast Guard ships. But all of this is very sensitive. Just last December 9, the Chinese Navy was able to use, in my opinion, very up-to-date and sophisticated electronic and imagery intelligence to outfox Japanese Coast Guard ships and advance China's claim to disputed islands in this area here. The Japanese were caught flat-footed, and it is this kind of capability that is going to challenge you and your leaders increasingly in the coming years. China, for decades, has had a basic foreign policy mantra that we, China, will not interfere in the affairs of others. This is a mantra that it's served it well. It has allowed China to differentiate itself from the United States, which has had to go forth many times to address not only threats to the United States, but collective threats, such as the war on terrorism. China does not participate in the war on terrorism to the degree that the United States does. Chinese troops and military forces are not committed to the battle in Iraq or Afghanistan. China does not do so because it does not want to be perceived as an imperial power, so as it tries to portray the United States. But China is starting to take steps abroad. One of the first major steps that China has taken to project power in the last few months began in mid-December, when China decided to send 2 destroyers and a refueling tanker to join the anti-pirate patrols off of Somalia. But China has done so in its unique way. It has only had a minimum amount of contact with the United Nations-led group that is trying to coordinate this anti-piracy activity. But it largely has sent its ships to operate alone and to, of course, an audience back home for political reasons. Here we see some pictures of one of the Chinese destroyers on station, and a rare picture of China's shipborne special operators. Their special operators, by the way, are armed with automatic mortars. Not very useful when you're trying to save a big flammable oil or gas container, but still. I think these pictures were meant for the Somali pirates, and I'm sure they've seen them. Now, while we're talking about power projection, one of the important programs for the People's Liberation Army has been to build their own indigenous aircraft carrier fleet. People's Liberation Army Navy has long regarded the United States power projection and carrier amphibious projection capabilities with envy. And since about the mid-1980s, the PLA Navy has had a very powerful lobby that has pushed their government to the point of deciding to build their own aircraft carrier task force, aircraft carrier navy. The leader of this effort is a now retired Admiral Liu Hua-ching, the first Chinese naval officer to rise to the top position of the People's Liberation Army. He would have rather that China have several aircraft carriers now, but his ambition was thwarted by economic requirements of the 1980s and early 1990s. But by the mid-1990s, this program was back on track. And in the interim, China obtained, I believe, 4 aircraft carriers, 3 aircraft carriers from the former Soviet Union and 1 from Australia that was built in Great Britain during World War II. All of these carriers were brought to China and studied. China's first aircraft carrier will likely be the Varyag, which now resides in Dalian Harbor and is undergoing a slow refurbishment. China has drawn this process out, in my opinion, so that it does not create a political backlash in the region. But the backlash will come. Here we have a picture sourced from the internet that was taken in early December that shows the Varyag, which would normally carry long-range anti-ship missiles. That the compartment for these missiles has been removed. What will go in its place, we don't know yet. If it remains empty and they rebuild that space, they could increase the aircraft hangar by 1/3. Or they could replace that space with long-range missiles of Chinese design. But when this carrier enters service, it will likely serve to train early Chinese naval aviators and also train the larger PLA in anti-carrier doctrine and tactics. Right now, it is assumed not to have an engine. That, of course, it will need an engine in order to fulfill its mission. But even if China were to tow the Varyag out to regions north of Taiwan and light tires on fire on the deck and make movies, it would serve as an effective weapon on a political level. Now, in the last month, Chinese spokesmen have been quoted in various media reports essentially confirming China's intention to start building indigenous aircraft carriers within the next several years. This is a significant change in China's public stance toward aircraft carriers. For most of my career studying China's military, China's official stance has been to deny that it has the ambition to build aircraft carriers. This is a reflection of a long-standing adherence to denial, practices of denial and deception, which China has embraced through most of its known political history, extending back thousands of years. During all of this time of denial, of course, China was studying and preparing its industry to build these carriers. Now it has reached a point where it is going to start doing so. A good friend of mine who visited China about a year and a half ago, had a nice dinner with some of his former associates in the PLA Navy who have reached high rank. My friend was told by these associates that China will probably build 4 to 6 carriers. Reports that have come out of China in the last month offer indications that China could have 3 to 4 carriers by the end of the next decade. All of this, of course, depends upon funding remaining the same, China's economy growing at a fast pace in order to afford not just aircraft carriers, but the full range of China's military modernization effort, a taste of which I hope to offer today. China's indigenous aircraft carriers are said to possibly resemble the Varyag. This is a 50 to 60 plus thousand ton carrier, not quite as large as the Nimitz or Ford class carriers that you may be serving on, will not carry as many aircraft, but this is just the first generation. China will build second and third generation aircraft carriers that could be nuclear powered, much larger. They certainly will be able to benefit from a great deal of former Soviet or Russian technology and expertise as they begin their tradition of a carrier navy. The Russians have told us that they would like to build a new class of aircraft carriers. They will likely offer this technology and this plans or sell them to China. China, which has already benefited greatly from Russian technology. Russian technology is going into the Varyag now, Ukrainian technology as well. And China will also likely build other types of aircraft carrying platforms. This is an artist's projection of the type 081 LPD that could be built within the next few years. And here we have a late Soviet design for a VSTOL, vertical short takeoff or landing aircraft carrying carrier. China is also working hard to assemble its first carrier air wing. Initially, it will likely comprise of some number of modified Sukhoi 33 fighter bombers. The Sukhoi 33, in terms of range and maneuverability, is more than a match for the F-18E Super Hornet. Defenders of the Super Hornet will come back and say that the electronics in the weapons are superior to what the Russians would sell the Chinese or buy themselves. Well, this is actually changing very quickly. The Russians are developing electronics, radar, electronically scanned radar, and very long-range air-to-air missiles, which I would suggest to you are very compatible with the capabilities that we are now putting on the Super Hornet. If China begins its aircraft carrier era with a upgraded, modified Sukhoi 33, it will be starting its carrier operations with a combat aircraft that is very comparable, if not in some ways superior, to the Super Hornet. That, in my opinion, would be a tragedy. And it would be my hope that as you go forward in your careers, that you ask hard questions as to why this is happening, why it has happened, and what can be done to make our national leadership aware that we're basically entering into an arms race. And it may not look like the Chinese are running very large or very fast right now, but over the course of the next decade, this will happen. And wars are won the hard way, but it can be possible to avoid them in the way that the United States has chosen to avoid them for the most part very well during your lifetime and since World War II, has been to deter them by presenting any possible aggressor with what will be a superior force that they could not defeat. Well, it is this margin of deterrence which is eroding before our eyes as China embarks on the construction of multiple aircraft carriers armed with aircraft that are compatible, if not superior, to what you will be flying if that is where your career leads you. China is also developing a carrier-capable version of its J-10 fighter, a fighter that was very difficult for China to develop on itself, but within the last 5 years, China has managed to pull this program together, and it will now be featured in multiple versions, possibly a carrier-capable version. Here we have a possible design from the Shenyang Corporation, which looks very much like the Sukhoi design, but is Shenyang's attempt, most likely, to develop an indigenous carrier aircraft to validate Chinese technologies, and which will likely be competitive in capability with the Russian Sukhoi. Here we have, if you look closely, a portion of what is likely going to be China's first carrier AWACS. This is an outtake from a picture that emerged in 2005 when a top Chinese politician was visiting an aircraft design bureau. This aircraft could also be configured to perform other missions, like anti-submarine warfare, carrier onboard delivery. Here is a supersonic trainer that is about to be purchased by the PLA Air Force, but in my opinion will likely be developed into the first trainer for the PLA Navy. This is an old picture of a Russian Yakovlev proposal for a V-STAL fighter that is somewhat comparable to the V-STAL F-35B that some of you Marines will become familiar with. There was a very curious report at the end of the year that Russia is trying to sell a version of this fighter to China. The Yakovlev program was basically defunded in the early 1990s, but the Bureau has obviously continued some work, and if the Chinese buy it and essentially decide to co-fund its development, well, the Russians hope to gain an F-35-like fighter, but then again, so might the Chinese. So this is another development to follow. Okay, moving on to other aspects of Chinese power projection. China is actively projecting its power not just economically, but also politically, in the sense that China is now trying to create a number of political organizations and networks that, should they gain power and influence, will compete with American-led alliances and military networks. One of the most important is the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, an organization which largely exists, in my opinion, to defend the autocracies which are their member states. The Shanghai Cooperation Organization is also becoming increasingly militarized. Its first Russian-Chinese exercise took place in 2005, in which for the first time in the history of communist China, a foreign country deployed large-scale military forces to Chinese territory in the form of paratroop forces and large combat aircraft. There were even simple but still obvious naval exercises. The last large-scale exercise took place in Russia in August of 2007. And for the first time ever, China deployed a significant military force beyond its borders. The force was rather small, a total of about 3,000 personnel, maybe 24 combat aircraft, a couple dozen armored vehicles. But for China, in the PLA, this was a very important step, and one that is giving rise to the creation of new doctrines and operations for military operations well beyond China's border. This is a beginning, but this is a trend that will grow increasingly over the course of your careers. China also projects power by aiding proxy forces, its allies. All of George Bush's axis of evil states, a term that has kind of fallen out of use in recent years, all members of the axis of evil have very useful political and military technology relationships with China. Here we see the range of technologies that China has sold Iran. Uranium reprocessing technology for Iran comes from China. This is some of the uranium reprocessed yellowcake, which will then be further reprocessed into uranium which can be used for nuclear weapons. This is an Iranian-made version of a short-range surface-to-air missile, some of which have been given to Iraqi insurgents who have fired a few at American aircraft in Iraq. This is a Chinese-made fast attack craft armed with Chinese-made missiles, one of several versions of Chinese-designed ships that the Iranian Navy operates, and which could very easily be configured to undertake surprise slash attack tactics against American naval ships or more importantly, civilian tankers and other merchant ships in the critical Straits of Hormuz. Chinese cruise missile technology has been sold to Iran and other anti-ship missiles as well. There was some reporting that the recent conflict in Gaza that flared up in December featured use by Hamas of new long-range Chinese artillery rockets. This was the reported version of that long-range artillery rocket. Other proxies that China arms include Pakistan, largely to counter India, but also to gain a very important foothold within the larger Islamic world. Here we have former Chinese premier talking to a man named A.Q. Khan, who is largely credited with being the father of Pakistan's nuclear capabilities today. Pakistan is a very troubled state. Some would say a failed state, a state that could very easily crumble into warring factions of different radical Islamist stripe should the army lose control in that society. And if that should happen, Pakistan's nuclear weapons would then be up for grabs. And who would get them? Terrorists? Friends of Osama bin Laden? Friends of the Taliban? And what would they do with those nuclear weapons? Attack the United States? And then who do we retaliate against? An amorphous Taliban or other terrorist organization? Or should we also consider that to the degree that Pakistan's nuclear capability comes from Chinese technology, should we hold China responsible for having unleashed an age of nuclear terrorism? These are very hard and difficult questions, well beyond our pay grade, I'd suggest, but challenges that our leaders will have to answer. Here we have a long-range or intermediate-range solid-fuel ballistic missile of Chinese design that Pakistan is now producing. Here we have the Taepodong-1, North Korea's first long-range ballistic missile, a three-stage missile, the third stage, the solid-fuel stage, which was based on Chinese technology. China has also, at various points, contributed to North Korea's current nuclear capabilities. China will also be confronting you as your career progresses in the form of new, very capable, high-technology weapons that will soon be entering the international arms markets. China has had a reputation of having produced very low technology and low capability weapons for decades. When we first attacked Iraq in 1990-91, Saddam Hussein was armed with many Chinese-made armored vehicles, which were literally slaughtered. If we should happen to face modern Chinese armor or modern Chinese combat aircraft in a third country in the future, it won't be so easy. China is reportedly to have sold these 300 to 400 kilometer range anti-ship cruise missiles to Pakistan within the last month. China has tried to compete in Malaysia's recent competition to develop a new amphibious assault craft. China has sold advanced radar to Venezuela. And this fighter, the Chengdu FC-1, a multi-role fighter, not quite as capable as our F-16, but can be had for half the price. This, I expect, will prove to be a very popular seller over the next decade. And unfortunately, you may have opportunities to meet it in the sky. China also challenges the United States in terms of how it has mobilized its universities, its military companies, its research and development sector toward the development of very innovative, high technology with a priority on serving military requirements. If you were in China and had the opportunity to enter an aerospace graduate program, your work for the PLA would basically start at that point. Your papers, your graduate theses, would essentially have been assigned to you by the PLA to solve a certain problem that would be useful to companies trying to build things. That usually doesn't happen in the United States, although it's possible. There's a lot of industry-funded research that goes on, but it's not nearly as organized and regimented to the service of military R&D as it is in China. China expends a great deal of effort in terms of espionage. The vast majority of Chinese espionage is essentially legitimate in terms of exploiting open sources. And China does this very well. But China also has an innovative, formal, overt espionage program. A fundamental characteristic of its overt espionage campaign is the exploitation of overseas Chinese. For some of us, this is an uncomfortable fact. It is akin to racial profiling. But it is a fact that we simply have to face, and is one that has been demonstrated time and time again. It seems that almost every week another espionage case is being wrapped up by the FBI or some other investigative service involving Chinese Americans, naturalized Chinese citizens, or increasingly citizens from Taiwan, or even long-term Chinese Americans that fall essentially for appeals to Chinese nationalism. It's not a phenomena that is just confined to our Chinese community, but to other communities as well. I don't mean to single out Chinese Americans, but it is a fact that as part of its espionage campaign, China targets overseas Chinese and does so very effectively. Here we have the case of Greg Chung, who served as an innovative aerospace engineer, first in Rockwell and then in Boeing, played a part in the design of our space shuttle and the supersonic B-70 bomber, B-1 bomber. He is now in the middle of his trial, and at least according to federal indictments, he spent years turning over manuals from the B-1 bomber, went to China and essentially gave them great advice on how to build their own space shuttle. Here we have Noshir Gwadyer, an ethnic Indian who helped design the infrared masking technology, which is a large part of the stealth capability of our B-2 bomber. Mr. Gwadyer was hired by Chinese concerns to go to China and essentially taught them how to build stealthy cruise missiles. Stealthy cruise missiles that will very likely be targeted at your ship. This is a great concern. I spent an evening with a refugee in the United States from the Tiananmen episode who before he came to the United States, worked in the academy that develops China's solid fuel rocket motors. And he patiently explained to me that evening how China's solid fuel rocket motors did not work until the early 1990s, when the U.S. company, the former Martin Marietta Corporation, which is based just north or based in Maryland, sold China a solid fuel kick motor that would be used to place a satellite in its final orbit. That solid fuel rocket motor basically taught the 4th Academy how to make an effective solid fuel rocket motor. Before then, he would say that their DF-21 solid fuel medium range missiles would fail as often as they would successfully launch. And he had a very poignant tale to tell of the top brass of the PLA being brought out to witness one of these launches. And about 5 seconds after the missile was launched, it blew up. And in the corner, when this happened, there was silence in the launch control room. Glum faces. Failure. Except in one corner, there were large cheers, loud cheers. Their responsibility was the fail-safe device, the automatic destruct device. But at any rate, here we have a model of China's proposal for a large commercial airliner. Since the 1960s, China has tried to build a large commercial airliner to compete with the United States and the Europeans. They are about to reach this goal, in large part due to very patient exploitation of European and American technology. In fact, Airbus has just started a co-production assembly line outside of Beijing that will help Chinese industry master many aspects of efficient production of large aircraft. This is a four-engine airliner. It looks to be about the size of a Boeing 767, which has been is one of the candidates for our next generation aerial tanker. It's my opinion that this aircraft will probably serve in the PLA Air Force and Navy as a refueler just as soon as it enters Chinese airlines. China is also excelling in many other high technologies. Here we have a laser rangefinder, Dazzler. China has been researching electromagnetic weapons, a great effort there. Micro weapons. This is a 3-centimeter helicopter that China built over a decade ago. Rail guns may be on your ships by the end of the next decade. They could be on China's at about the same time. Rail guns are viewed by our military, our Department of Defense, as a transformational technology that we will use to remain ahead of our potential adversaries. Well, not if China gets there first. Here we have a very curious picture. That's a pigeon with a microchip planted in its brain. This is a biomechanical system. Biomechanical technologies are viewed, not just here, other places, but in China, as future military systems. This is a possible artist projection of a tactical laser. All of these could be fielded by China in some form within the next decade. Moving on quickly, I have many more slides to go through, so I'll just be flipping through them. China has made a great investment in information technologies. Part of our superiority today is because we have invested so much in the creation of space and other electronic networks that allow us to operate jointly and intimately. China is right on our heels in this pursuit. This is a network that would be just quite familiar to many American military operators today. Space. China is not only working to exploit outer space for information purposes to affect battles on Earth, it's also working to deny outer space. China will have, or has now, 2 families of imaging satellites in orbit. Their numbers will grow. Last year, China launched its first data relay satellite, which is very important in terms of allowing real-time global transmission of imagery and data. You don't have to wait for the satellite to get to your side of the Earth to find out what's happening on the other side, where you might have forces ready to pounce. China is also about to complete, early in the next decade, its own global positioning satellite system called COMPASS. GPS has been of enormous use to the United States in transforming our military in the last 15 years and allowing us to move from dumb bombs to smart bombs, allowing us to target with very useful precision so as to avoid collateral damage. GPS has also become a very important part of our civilian electronic economic infrastructure. For China to build a competing global satellite network is part and parcel of what China views as necessary for it to become a global power in the coming decades. And China is also working very hard to develop combat capabilities in outer space. In my opinion, this is the launch vehicle that formed the basis for the anti-satellite missile that China used in January 2007 to knock down a satellite. Here we have an air-launched space launch vehicle that could allow bombers to target satellites from virtually any orbit around the Earth. China is mastering microsatellite, nanosatellite technologies, and this is a technology demonstrator for a space plane. It could become a shuttle, it could become an unmanned combat vehicle, a bomber. Space bombers are mentioned in Chinese military technical literature. These developments could force us to consider similar capabilities. In fact, they are forcing us to consider similar capabilities. All of China's manned space missions have performed military operations, either electronic or optical surveillance. This is the orbital module of the Shenzhou, the first manned mission. It carried 2 electro-optical surveillance systems. China's last manned space mission took place at the end of September last year. In my opinion, and I've written about this, China used that mission to practice a co-orbital anti-satellite interception against the International Space Station. Haven't read much about that in the press, I assume, but yeah, the last Chinese space mission, in my opinion, was they used our International Space Station for target practice. It's on our website. You can read it if you're interested. China has ambitions to develop space planes, manned space stations, and will likely send its people to the moon within the next decade or within the early 2020s. China's manned space program is controlled by the PLA. It will reflect PLA priorities. All of these endeavors, in my opinion, will have military functions when they are realized. China is also, in my opinion, developing quickly an ability to shoot down our ballistic missiles. China is modernizing its own nuclear ballistic missile capabilities, but what is less understood is that China is working on a missile defense capability as well. China politically criticizes America's missile defense program and scores many points in overseas fora doing so. But what China will not admit is that it is building its own missile defense capability as well. This is not necessarily a completely bad development. It is at least possible to consider a world in which Russian, American, and Chinese nuclear ballistic missiles are essentially canceled by corresponding anti-missile capabilities. When that happens, China will consider doing something that it has refused to do traditionally, and that is perhaps enter into negotiations that will try to control, limit, and maybe verify these arsenals. Many of my colleagues don't believe in the doctrine or philosophy of missile defense. Certainly, many Chinese strategists would resist this path, but it is at least something hopeful that could possibly develop within your careers as well. ICBM modernization is taking place at a rapid pace. Here we have a new mobile long-range ballistic missile, most likely multiple warheads, an early solid fuel ICBM, the DF-31. In my opinion, existing large liquid-fueled ICBMs of the DF-5 family may have multiple warheads now. Combined with estimates that China may build 5 second-generation SSBNs. We're looking at the potential of an early warhead inventory of about 500. That is just my educated guess. If the American warhead inventory goes below 1,000, then we have to ask, are we going to have enough warheads to both deter Russia and China? I don't like this math. I'm not comfortable with it. And I would hope that as this occurs to our leaders, that they would not be comfortable with it either. Just a kind of off the napkin estimate that is also in my book. China's movement to construct a second-generation SSBN fleet is going to have a great impact on strategy and on the disposition of our naval forces in East Asia. It is highly unlikely that the shallow Bohai Sea will become the operating area for Chinese SSBNs. Most likely, they will be put in Hainan Island in a new base near Sanya, because these SSBNs can have almost immediate access to very deep operating areas. And also, if you look to the east of Taiwan, you see even deeper SSBN operating areas. Aircraft carriers, submarines, and ships will likely have as a main mission the protection of China's SSBNs. And as that happens, this real estate will become far dearer to the PLA. And should you be transiting between the Middle East and bases in Japan, the Chinese are likely to become far more interested in what you're doing, where you're going, and that could give rise to incidents. Here we have some recent satellite photos of construction of this new, what will be an underground submarine base. The entrance of the underground submarine base at Hainan, an early visit by their first second-generation SSBN. Some more photos of the new base at Sanya, and a buildup of islands in the South China Sea that China occupies. Islands off of the Philippines. China is also investing heavily in land attack cruise missiles. At least 3 families of land attack cruise missiles are now in development or being deployed. Short-range ballistic missiles. China has over 1,000 of these deployed near Taiwan. And these are also being developed from new, cheaper, easier to produce artillery rockets. And China is also developing its longer range missiles into revolutionary anti-ship ballistic missiles. Right now, our ability to shoot down these anti-ship ballistic missiles is questionable. I know it's a high priority for the Navy to develop defenses against these, but they will also be sold to China's clients. We could be facing these off of Iran, Pakistan, Cuba, Venezuela. It's a very, very unique and troubling technology. China is developing it. We are not. I suggest that we should be developing these too. The PLA Air Force is rapidly moving into, here we have Russian-built and designed 4th-generation fighters, the J-10, which we've seen already. Here a fighter bomber version is quickly going to be developed. Here we have China's medium attack platform, which will soon probably emerge in a stealthier version, the JH-7, and modern munitions. Here we have China's GPS-guided bombs, new laser-guided bombs. Here a possible ramjet-powered air-to-air missile, which could have a range of up to 300 kilometers, which I would suggest exceeds the range of anything that we put on our carrier fighters today. It's not in the field yet, but at least China has revealed the intention to build this very long-range air-to-air missile. Fifth-generation fighters are on the way. At least 2 designs for fifth-generation fighters coming out of Shenyang, Chengdu. Here we have a cockpit display that looks just like what you will be facing in the F-35. Bombers, China has the option to purchase Russian bombers, which are being marketed, and has also taken an old 1950s design, upgraded it with modern electronics, land attack cruise missiles, much like we've done with the Boeing B-52. And here is a curious model from an air show, Chinese air show. I took this picture, possibly indicating a future design for a stealth bomber. Electronic aircraft, AWACS, ELINT, command aircraft are now being produced. UAVs are a very important priority for China. Hypersonic UAVs in the range of surveillance and combat UAVs. This UAV is based on an old fighter, and about 200 of those are deployed now. Modern air defense systems, both long-range and very sophisticated short-range systems. Naval platforms, a great area of investment as well. China's second-generation nuclear attack submarine, a second-generation conventional design, third-generation conventional design, and Russian Kilo-class submarines. When armed with Russian long-range anti-ship missiles, this is the footprint they would have around Yokosuka. Surface ships are being purchased from Russia or being built with Russian radar and surface-to-air missiles. These are the 2 destroyers that were recently sent to Somalia. And China is also investing in its own littoral combat ship capabilities. There are going to be about 80 to 90 of these built, and they could be developed into frigate-size combatants as well. Twin hull, swath design, very fast, high seakeeping ability. Amphibious projection capability is also growing. My sources say that China will build up to initially 6 LHDs and 3 LPDs. That is a notional capability of projecting about 2,000 to 3,000 troops. And China is also developing specialized armor for amphibious assault. Airborne transport is also growing. This is an indigenous proposal concept that could be built toward the end of the next decade. And China is also purchasing Russian transports and developing civilian transports, which could be turned into tankers or other platforms. Airborne equipment is following quickly. Army modernization, I won't go into for time's sake, but again, a great effort. Attack helicopters, very modern, capable armor. This tank, the T-90, is very competitive with the M1 Abrams, but much cheaper. Digital soldier equipment, China is investing a great deal there. Laser-guided anti-tank rounds, advanced anti-tank helicopters, all on the way. And these are armored vehicles that are far more deployable, much like our Stryker vehicles. This is a cartoon that I found on a Chinese website about 2 years ago, showing some gentleman's view of what he hopes is your nightmare. Here we have an anti-ship ballistic missile honing down on a carrier, targeting 5,000 of your colleagues. More that died in 9/11, more than died at Pearl Harbor. This is serious. China is going to be an effective, let's hope not a deadly competitor in our future and over the course of your career. Finally, I like to put this up. This is a special operations training session, and they are being instructed in basic English orders. Give up, no harm. You have no way out. Lay down your arms. Who is this targeted at? We don't know. But I want to again thank you for the privilege of addressing you this morning. I want to thank you again for having chosen your career, and I will be happy now to answer any and all of your questions.
Hang tight for a second. We got about 15 minutes. Mr. Fisher is available for questions. If you have a question, just come up and line up and ask a question. Mr. Fisher, I'd actually like to ask the first one. Let's kick this off. You mentioned the idea of buying arms from other countries, the idea of developing indigenous to the country itself. A lot of times when we talk about in the military, when we learn about it, it's the idea of reverse engineering. That China would buy their platform, like the Su-30, Su-27, make their own version of it, the MKK. Can you speak a little bit about what countries China is necessarily purchasing from, and then obviously you already talked about who they're already providing their own versions of that for?
Yes, Lieutenant, thank you for the question. China has basically compressed 3 generations of military technical progress into 1 generation, due largely to its ability to have immense access to Russia's post-Soviet military-industrial complex. The Americans had access to this complex as well in the early 1990s, a very fascinating period of Chinese, Europeans, and Americans running all over Russia, trying to buy the best that they would have to offer, offered by, very often, engineers who had no income at all and could only sell the files of their former programs. Well, China benefited from this greatly. China hired a large number of Russian engineers, many of whom, thousands, probably still live and work in China. Indeed, China has reverse engineered, stolen, or purchased a great deal of the technology that it is now absorbing as its own. But what we have also been seeing, especially over the last decade, is a new emerging trend that China has successfully absorbed these technologies and is building new capabilities on top of that, indigenous capabilities. The Cultural Revolution, Mao's Cultural Revolution, basically put a 20-year hiatus on indigenous Chinese military technical progress. China was consumed in internal convolutions. Military engineers had to all go to farms, if not worse, to be re-educated. They weren't developing weapons. By the time this basically ended in the 1980s, China started reaching out. It reached out to the United States. We were ready to sell China technology in the name of counter-Soviet cooperation during most of the 1980s. Along came the Tiananmen incident, and there was a vast reorientation of American policy. But the Russians, and for a period the Israelis, the Europeans, some European countries, continue to sell China military technology, which is still propelling their progress today. But what we are seeing now, and will see increasingly in the future, is that young, bright Chinese engineers, many of whom have been educated abroad, in Russia, even here in the United States, who have returned to China, are doing their jobs very well. Okay, we'll go to this side of the room. Yes, sir.
Sir, you talked a lot about technology, but I was wondering, just as far as training the Chinese military, first, just how generally well trained are they, especially the ground forces? Second, how often do they do large-scale cooperative war games with their forces? Third, how well mechanized are their ground forces? I've heard in recent past they primarily have foot infantry with very little armored vehicles. And lastly, how well maintained is their equipment?
This has been a very important area of concern for our intelligence community, a great deal of effort in the part of not just the IC, but many academics who look at the PLA are concerned with these questions as well. And I would respond by saying that when there was a great uptick in interest in the study of the PLA in the late 1980s, early 1990s, there was quite justified but broad disdain for China's competence in these areas that you mentioned, all of them. A fighter squadron, you know, you had a situation where a MiG-21 built in one area of the country couldn't be maintained or based in another area of the country because the local manufacturing was different, the pieces wouldn't match, and definitely the engines couldn't fit in the respective aircrafts. And that problem was replicated across the board in other PLA services. Training was not impressive. When China conducted its first attempt at a joint force exercise to intimidate Taiwan in 1995 and 1996, my friends in both the academic and military communities looked at China's effort as essentially a joke. I mean, other things were happening out at sea that have not been really spoken to that, as far as I can gather, were a bit more scary. However, in terms of aircraft operations, amphibious operations, we could see that the Chinese were just at the beginning of their learning curve. Okay, that was then. This is a decade later. And I would offer that across the board, in terms of logistics, application of information technologies to logistics, in terms of training, in terms of creating dedicated training bases, and again, applying IT to training in all the ways that you're familiar with as well, has taken place, and there has been a not very well described revolution in terms of the soft side of the PLA. Are they as well versed in joint operations as we are over Afghanistan and Iraq? No, they're not. But are they good enough to prevail and assemble a surprise joint strike force that could smother Taiwan's military? Oh yeah, they could. And that enough is something that should generate great concern. In fact, I think it does.
Thank you very much, sir.
Yes, sir.
Sir, I'm curious about the past decade, the Democratic People's Party of Taiwan has pursued a policy of trying to get increased independence, doing things such as attempting to change the country's name and stuff. But President Chen lost elections, President May, most of these corruption issues, and there's been a switch back to trying to embrace China, actually engage in Chinese policies. Do you feel that that's going to be a continuing trend in Taiwanese politics, or do you feel that that's going to go back towards a pendulum swing back towards PPP?
This is a very critical question, very important, and it's fundamental to your future careers in the East Asian AOR. The transition between the Democratic DPP, Democratic Progressive Party government in Taiwan, back to the old Kuomintang party, has universally been greeted as a very positive development for Taiwanese democracy. The fact that this transition could take place always, when we look at a democratic society emerging, the first election is not usually the most important election, but it's the second election. Have they managed to internalize democratic legal structures and, in a sense, build a democratic political culture that can truly survive? It took this country decades to accomplish that. For Taiwan to have made such great progress in essentially 2 decades speaks well. However, the question that you raise is very important. The Kuomintang was elected to solve Taiwan's economic challenges, but also there was a great popular desire to have a better, less confrontational relationship with China. However, the majority of Taiwanese are not ready to surrender their hard-won democratic freedoms, because that is exactly what would be required if they were to immediately, or really any time in this decade, surrender their sovereignty, full sovereignty, to that of China. On the other hand, China has made clear that it is not going to wait forever for unification to take place. And by a cursory examination of the forces that China has brought to bear on Taiwan, it makes clear that they are serious. At a time of great distraction here in the United States, I don't know, let's say a terrorist nuclear attack, China may elect to achieve reunification with Taiwan in a non-peaceful way. What we do today to help the Taiwanese defend themselves and to preserve their own ability to, as independently as possible, determine their future, contributes to stability, helps to prevent conflict, and, in my opinion, creates the basis for a future relationship with China that could be more positive. I hope that answers your question.
Thanks, sir.
Yes, sir.
Sir, I was wondering the effect of energy resources, more importantly, oil reserves, how it's going to affect China's economic and military operations in the near and distant future.
Very, very important question. It will have an enormous impact. China, we can read numerous discussions and debate in China's military press and popular press about the need for China to develop a larger navy, in part to protect its access not just to petroleum, but to all manner of resources necessary for its economy. China is indeed very vulnerable to resource denial, not just petroleum, but to all of the resources that are necessary to feed its industry. Many countries, in turn, also depend on their sale of these natural resources to China. African continent, Australia, terribly dependent on maintaining the freedom of these sea lanes, as is China. However, I would also add that this development, this dynamic, is also pretty obvious to us. And for a long time, at a high government level, and indeed in terms of our military-to-military dialogue with China, we have attempted to interest China increasingly in cooperative maritime activities that will protect what we view as a common good, freedom of the seas. China, by and large, however, has been reluctant to join any activity where the United States is the designated leader. This happens occasionally, but not very often. But indeed, China will be building its Navy in part to defend its access to resources. But as this Navy grows, especially the carrier Navy, it can be used for to advance many other political purposes as well. Yes, sir.
So I wrote an analysis that the Chinese economy is essentially bubbling, and that within this decade, or perhaps the next, it will pop. How can the Chinese continue to develop at the rate that they're developing in technologies and in the amount of resources that they're creating after this bubble pops, or if we use our sea and air forces to deny them the resources that they need to continue developing?
Well, you point out a very important dynamic that we should be aware of as well as we monitor China's increasingly modern military developments. As I mentioned earlier, indeed, it's not just the Chinese economy, but Chinese society itself, which is very vulnerable to upending. Political chaos is not abnormal in Chinese history. Chinese history is one of very regular but violent upheaval. A good friend of mine, Mr. Gordon Chang, wrote a very provocative book several years ago, The Coming End of China, or The Coming Collapse of China, in which he patiently lists China's economic vulnerabilities, the weaknesses in its financial system, the ecological challenges, enormous ecological challenges that it will face. Not to mention the challenges of trying to sew together what is essentially a disparate empire of ethnic minorities that don't necessarily want to be part of political China. Indeed, a sharp economic downturn this year or in the next several years could lead to the creation of chaos that could very deeply threaten the power position of the Communist Party. But I would also point out that the Communist Party leadership is very much aware of all of these internal challenges. And since the Tiananmen incident, has invested heavily in the creation of an internal army called the People's Armed Police, which is increasingly armed with sophisticated weapons and capabilities. China is a police state. It has surveillance capabilities that can only grow as the internet, cell phones, or in the future, imagine computer chips that are powerful enough to contain GPS locating devices. You could basically transfer the political control functions of the Neighborhood Party Committee, which is the basis of China's political system, to a set of computers with programs that make sure you go to where you have to go to get indoctrination, or if you're late for your indoctrination, well, you don't get this or you don't get that. It can become quite sophisticated. And the tools are available for the Chinese communist system to continue for quite a long time. So we just simply can't assume that the dire economic facts of China are going to result in the political impacts that we might otherwise expect, or were proven in the case of the fall of the Soviet Union.
Thank you.
Last question, everybody hang on. One more question, and we'll dismiss you after that. So.
Wait. One more. Yes, sir.
international student from Taiwan. I don't have any question. I just want to say, if China attack Taiwan or China attack United States of America, we will never negotiate. We will no longer surrender. We will no longer be afraid. We are here to defend our country. And
Okay, thank you so much for your interest in the Cross Chat. We do want to thank Mr. Fisher for coming, and I just want to reiterate how important this is. You always say it's so important to know thy enemy, and the enemy is strong.